Amen. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. This morning in Mike's wonderful prayer, he mentioned giving thanks for Danny and Lee Bratcher and their work in South America. On the bulletin this morning, it says I'm beginning a series tonight, but we're going to delay that till next Sunday night because Danny is going to present a report to us tonight and teach and preach a little bit tonight. So we encourage you to be back for that, but don't get confused. That series that I've talked about in my little article this morning won't begin until next Sunday. We begin a new series today on the parables of Jesus. You know, Jesus was a master teacher. I think it says something about the power of story when you realize that a little more than a third of the recorded teachings of Jesus in the New Testament are parables. He taught many of life's most important principles by telling stories, by helping other people to think in pictures, as it were. The word parable itself literally means to throw alongside. So in other words, parables are comparisons. One thing is placed alongside another thing for the purpose of comparison. It's a comparison between earthly things and spiritual truths. A comparison between something that helps us understand the other thing better. So a biblical parable can be defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. I hope you picked up one of the little outlines this morning. We're back supplying those again, and when we get back into our youth groups, that will, or our home groups, that will help us to have more things to discuss. But I encourage you to keep these, maybe even form a little notebook, because it can be a helpful study for you in the future. See, some of what the Gospels call parables are not really stories as we think of them. For instance, Mark chapter 7 contains these words from Jesus. He said, "Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." Now, the writers of the Gospels call that a parable. You and I would call that something more like a proverb because it's not really a story per se in the way that we understand stories. So in a sense, a parable can be sort of a loose term describing something that's really more of a figurative saying. Yet when we look at the stories of Jesus, almost all of his stories are comparisons, and they take the form of stories. Well, so what are the characteristics of parables? Well, there's several I want to mention to you. Number one, Jesus' parables were original. Throughout history, every civilization has had its stories, and every civilization has had its great storytellers. Jesus was not the first person to use the method of parables in order to teach. As a matter of fact, there are some parables in the Old Testament. One of the best-known parables in the Old Testament is the story of Nathan the prophet who came to David. You remember that one? After David sinned with Bathsheba? And he came in before David and he told him this story about a rich man and a poor man. The poor man had one little lamb that was so close to him he was like a pet. The rich man had a whole flock of sheep, and yet the rich man took the poor man's lamb and sold it to provide food for a guest the rich man was having. Well, it had a very simple point that we all get. And so we've got this in the Old Testament. Ancient Greeks actually used parables, but nobody told parables like Jesus. Jesus did not tell somebody else's story. He came up with new stories. And his stories were so vivid, they were so imaginative, they were so surprising sometimes, that we still easily remember his stories, his parables, 2,000 years after he told them. Here's a second characteristic of the parables. They were brief. Jesus made his point quickly before his listeners had a chance to perhaps turn him off. His stories quickly captured people's attention, and they held their attention. Jesus was sort of in and out like a flash, and yet the stories left behind were so memorable. Some of his parables are only a few sentences long, and yet they're tremendous stories. A third characteristic of parables: they caused people to think. He used parables to arouse people's curiosity. His stories were always so captivating that people could not walk away from Jesus until they had heard the end of the story. They were just sort of riveted by the stories that he told. And Jesus' parables usually ended in such a way that people were unexpecting the ending. They were surprising endings. Sometimes the way Jesus concluded his parables were quite shocking to people. His stories were so vivid and sometimes so strange that it just sort of shook people's minds up and caused them to look at truths they had known for a long time, but to look at them in a totally different way. That's what makes Jesus' parables so memorable, and also what makes them so challenging. A fourth characteristic: Jesus' parables were about things in everyday life. They weren't high philosophy or deep kind of subject matter. They were just average, ordinary things that everybody in his audience would have understood and used every day. His stories were about things in nature, or about things in social life, or political life, or in domestic home life. His stories were about farmers who would sow and reap. They were stories about merchants who were selling and buying. There were stories about coins and sheep and nets and trees and banquets and wedding feasts and vineyards and treasures and weeds and just things that they encountered in everyday life. And so Jesus would use these very common earthly things to draw a parallel between those and spiritual truths that helped people understand the spiritual truths much better. A fifth characteristic of parables: some of his parables were very confrontational. The application of his parables was so clear that it was like sometimes a knife just piercing a person's heart and their soul and their motives. Take, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son. The primary lesson in that story is the lesson that the Father, or God, is a for God. But there's a message in that parable as well, and that's the truth that we also need to be forgiving of those who have strayed away from God, who want to come back. And so when Jesus is telling that parable, especially the Pharisees who heard him tell the parable got the point. And it was a very confrontational point, because they were so judgmental about anyone that they considered to have strayed away that they could quickly, and often did, exclude those people and gave them very little room, very little grace, very little mercy to ever come back into the fold of God. And so Jesus' parables could just be sort of in your face, clear, with a message that was loud and clear. Sometimes Jesus would begin his parables by asking, "What do you think about?" And then he would tell this story. Or sometimes he would turn to his listeners after having told them a parable, and he would ask them to make some sort of judgment based on what he had just told them. So his points were unavoidably clear and sometimes pointedly confrontational parables of Jesus, and that is the mysteries of God. These mysteries of God account for much of the surprise that we find in the stories. Sometimes the shock even in the stories. For instance, let me give you some examples. It is certainly common for a young man to waste his father's wealth and later want to return home. What's not so common is for a father to be as loving as the one is in the story of the parable, of a father who literally runs to meet his wayward son, who throws a banquet for his wayward son. See, that's totally unexpected. And yet Jesus had those kind of endings quite often. It's a mystery of understanding the nature of God. It's certainly common for a sheep to what was not common was for the shepherd to leave the entire rest of the flock to go after that one. It's no surprise for a person to incur a large debt, but what was for who had made the loan was the case. So these ending Jesus parables challenge us to think in new and different ways. And it's often these surprise and paradox stories that Jesus tells that opens our hearts to the mysteries of who God is and how God relates to His people. Well, why did Jesus use parables? Why did He teach in parables? There's a puzzling passage in Mark chapter 4, verses 33 and 34. And it says this: "With many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable." That's the last sentence I want you to notice. That's kind of a puzzling verse. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But let me ask you a question. Did Jesus teach only in parables? Were parables the only method that Jesus used to instruct people about God's Word and His will? Well, no. They were not the only teaching method Jesus used. Think about the Sermon on the Mount as an example. Except for the story right at the end of Matthew chapter 7, which is the story of the wise and the foolish builders, each one having built their house, one on the sand and one on the rock. Jesus tells that little parable there, but except for that one, the entire rest of the Sermon on the Mount is not a story, it's not a parable, it's just straightforward teachings about what people are to do and how they're to act and how they're to respond to life. Then what did Mark mean when he wrote, "He did not say anything to them without using a parable"? And why did he write that? Well, the answer can be found, I think, in Matthew chapter 12, where we read about a whole series of confrontations that Jesus had with the Pharisees. And He had had confrontations with the Pharisees before, but they just keep escalating and they just keep getting more and more tense and more frequent. As a matter of fact, Matthew chapter 12 says that the Pharisees were doing this now to try to trap Jesus. They were trying just to shut Him down any way that they could. And what got them so upset in Matthew chapter 12 was that Jesus had been healing people on the Sabbath day, which they said they should not be done, that was considered work on the Sabbath day. And so after healing a demon-possessed man who was both blind and mute, the people who witnessed this healing began to ask, could this be the Messiah? Could it be the promised one that the prophets have told us about through the years? Well, how do you think the Pharisees, how did they feel about that when they began hearing people say, could this Jesus be the Messiah? They were enraged. They didn't believe He was the Messiah, and they certainly didn't want the people believing He was the Messiah, and so they became very angry, and they then said this about Jesus: "It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons." In other words, Jesus' miracles, which, by the way, they never denied that He did. They never questioned the fact that He did miracles. They just said He's able to do them by the power of the devil himself. God, he's Satan. And in response to what the Pharisees said, "He who is with me is against me." And then He went on to insinuate that these Pharisees who had made that statement about Him had blasphemed against the Holy Spirit. And He said, "You will not be forgiven of that." In essence, Jesus was finished with them. He had had all He was going to take from the Pharisees. He had tried to work with them, He had tried to teach them, but they had gotten to the point where their hearts were so calloused and so cold. I believe many of them may have believed that He was from God, and yet because He was such a threat to their power and their position and their control, they just staunchly rejected Him and refused to believe in Him. In spite of what they knew to be true, they turned their backs and their hearts and their minds on Jesus. And so then we get to Matthew chapter 13, after Jesus had told another parable, which is the parable of the sower, where you go out, a sower goes and some seed fall on the hard ground, the thorny ground, and the fertile ground. You know that story. Right after that, His disciples asked Jesus, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And Jesus replied this way, and this is taken from the Message. Let me read it with you if you'll follow on the screens. "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And Jesus replied, "You've been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. Not everybody has this gift, this insight. It hasn't been given to them. Whenever someone has a ready heart for this, the insights and understandings flow freely. But if there is no readiness, any trace of receptivity soon disappears. That's why I tell stories, to create readiness, to nudge the people toward receptive insight. In their present state, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen till they're blue in the face and not get it. I don't want Isaiah's forecast repeated all over again." And then he quotes from Isaiah. "Your eyes are open, but you don't, or your ears are open, but you don't hear a thing. Your eyes are awake, but you don't see a thing. The people are blockheads. They stick their fingers in their ears so they won't have to listen. They screw their eyes shut so they won't have to look, so they won't have to deal with me face to face and let me heal them." So by deliberately rejecting the truth, the Pharisees had finally reached the point where they had lost the privilege of hearing any more plain truth from Jesus' lips. And here's still the truth today. When a person has no desire to seek Christ's meanings, then the symbolism of these simple stories that we call parables create nothing but confusion for them as well. They just don't make any sense. In short, Jesus' parables had a clear twofold purpose. Number one, they hid the truth from self-righteous, self-satisfied people who rejected Jesus, while the very same stories revealed the truth to those who had eager hearts and souls and childlike faith, those who were hungering and thirsting for righteousness. So when Mark says in Mark chapter 4, He did not say anything to them without using a parable, I believe Jesus, or Mark, is referring to the point in time where Jesus said to the Pharisees, "I'm just not going to speak plainly to you anymore. From now on, everything I'm going to say is going to be taught in the form of a parable." Well, let's talk about how to interpret the parables that we're going to be talking about in the next several weeks. It's really impossible to lay down any strict rules for exactly how to interpret every parable. And the reason for that is that the amount of comparison varies from one parable to another. Let me give you an example. In the parable of the sower, some of the small details do have meaning. They are given significance about the birds and the sun, and those things are important in that parable. There are other parables, however, like the parable of the prodigal son, where some of the small details really aren't given any significance. For instance, the fatted calf, or the music, or the dancing in the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus doesn't give any emphasis to those. Those particular pointed things, they're just things there to color the story and to give the story sort of an atmosphere. What's the difference between a parable and an allegory? Well, let's talk about that for just a second. If we're going to interpret Jesus' parables correctly, I think it's important that we talk about that difference, to distinguish between the two. There are similarities between parables and allegories. Both are stories, both make comparisons, but in an allegory, every single detail of an allegory has some specific meaning or some sort of almost hidden kind of meaning. Let me give you a couple of examples of an allegory and how that's different from a parable. Some of you in our room this morning have read Pilgrim's Progress. If you were an English major in school, I see a couple of them back there right now, that's pretty much required reading in college. You have to read John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1608. But it is a spiritual religious allegory about a man named Christian. Even his name, Christian, you see, has difference. Christian and his family are on this very difficult journey, and they're trying to get to a place called Celestial City. And so all the various little details of this story, every detail has some sort of meaning in it. Or allegories are usually full of myth and fiction and fantasy, as is the case with Aesop's fables. One of his best known fables is the story of the tortoise and the hare. And so in stories like the tortoise and the hare, forest creatures take on human traits, and forest creatures and animals and trees and these sorts of things teach us lessons in an allegory. So while allegories teach moral lessons, they are not the same as parables, certainly not the parables of Jesus. In contrast to allegories and fables, the parables of Jesus have no fables. They have no fantasies. Unlike allegories, in a parable, every detail does not necessarily have significance. The details of a parable may often just be there to add color to the story. So when interpreting the parables, the first question, and this is very important, if you don't remember anything else today, remember this. The most important question to ask of a parable is this: what is the main point? What is the main point or lesson of this story? Parables usually set forth one primary truth. Some of Jesus' parables do have secondary meanings, and when he would explain parables, sometimes he would do that, but more often than not, a parable just simply has one primary lesson. So look for that one central point. What about how the parables are arranged in the New Testament? Well, it's difficult to say how many parables there are in the Gospels. It depends on how you define parable. If you include in the definition of parable not only stories, but also these kind of riddles or these proverbs that we mentioned before, there are as many as 60 or 65 in the New Testament. If you take a parable to mean only stories that Jesus told, there's about 30 or 35 in the New Testament. And the way they're arranged is interesting. The Gospel of John, for instance, does not have any narrative parables at all. The only time the word parable is mentioned in the book of John, the Gospel of John, and only in the King James Version, is in John chapter 10, verse 6, where the modern translations, instead of using the word parable, they paraphrase or they translate that as a figure of speech. And there are a lot of figures of speech in John. John uses more of metaphors. For instance, you know in John all those I am passages? I am the way, I am the truth, the life, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. All of those are metaphors. You find those in John, but in John you don't find any parables. What you do find are the parables are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and mostly in Matthew and in Luke. Quite a few of Jesus' parables are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Other parables are found only in Matthew and Luke. There are a couple of parables that are found only in Mark and only in Luke. So you've got all this variety, but when you find parables that are in both Matthew and Luke, typically Luke will give a little bit more detail. He'll fill it out. He'll give it a little bit more character and a little bit more life. Now, what I've tried to do this morning in this introduction to the series on the parables is a bit like constructing a building. What's the first thing a contractor does, other than draw up the plans? But once the plans are drawn up, the very first thing a contractor does, whether he's building a skyscraper or a house, is dig the footings and lay the foundation. Now, frankly, of a construction project, the most boring, least interesting thing in all is what? It's the foundation. digging a hole in the ground and pouring concrete. Not very exciting. But we all know that without that foundation, the building that goes on top of it isn't going to stand very long. Now, in what I've just said in the last 60 seconds, do you realize what I've just done? I've just told you a parable to illustrate what I've tried to do today. And that is to say that before we really get into telling the stories themselves, which are exciting, which are thrilling, which are captivating, if we're going to interpret those correctly and understand how Jesus used them and then apply them to our lives, it's important that we go through the process of laying a foundation. I'll confess to you that probably you haven't been very interested in what I've said this morning. It's been more informational than it has been inspirational, and I understand that. But I also believe that before we get into these stories, what we're covering this morning is important because it will help us as we launch into that study. And so with this foundation laid, over the next 8 weeks, what I want us to do is to take 10 of Jesus' best-known parables. There'll be a couple of Sundays where we're going to look at 2. So that's how we get 10 into an 8-week period. And we'll look at those parables, we'll tell those exciting stories, we'll try to figure out exactly what Jesus wants us to get out of those and how He wants us to apply those to our lives. You know, the greatest story ever told is not a parable, it's a real story, and that's the story of Jesus Himself. How God became a human being and came to this earth, showed us how to live, taught us how to live, both in things like the Sermon on the Mount as well as in His stories. But then He died for us. He gave His life for us so that we could become His children and follow Him and have the hope of heaven forever, the forgiveness of our sins. And this morning, if you have never become a Christian, you have that opportunity, that invitation is yours. We'd love for you to come right now. Let's stand, let's sing together. Please come if you need.